Nice. It recorded on its own. That's great. I can't see anybody that's in the uh, in the attendee chat, but uh, thank you so much for popping in to the webinar and the start of Media and Martech Week. I'm really excited about the folks who are on this panel discussion today to talk about dashboards to decisions and reporting. We're talking CFOs. So yeah, I'm really excited about this. I'll just get started now. Um, Basically, I want to start off with the Calgary Marketing Association's vision. So, our vision at the Calgary Marketing Association is to make Calgary known as a world-class marketing community. Basically, what that means is we're trying to get the smartest marketers in the room to, celebrate the work that we're doing in Calgary. We're bringing in different workshops from around the world. I think from Sweden, Mark brought in for marketing effectiveness workshop. We're doing mentorship programs. We're doing podcasts. We're doing in-person events. We're doing these webinars, such as this Media and Martech Week, which is a webinar every day, all week, which I'm really excited about. So, yeah, we're here in Calgary to make this a world-class marketing community, and we can't do that without folks like our 2026 partners. There's a lot of them. This includes Alberta Magazine's Publishers Association, who is helping us put this Media Martech Week together, as well as Learngistics, who is taking care of our webinars now. I don't know, I'm pretty sure you were able to watch the opening video in the waiting room, which was awesome. They put that together, and they've been really helpful in gathering our panelists and some of our speakers into some tech checks and making sure that everything goes well. And yeah, we're really grateful to have them on board as well. And today, the first session is going to be reporting that CFOs trust. And that's going to include Brian from the Reporting Hub, Melissa from Calgary Co-op, Jake from Clear Motive, and our moderator, super smart person, Michelle Maynard, who's a VP of Media Director at True Media, who's got over 15 years of experience leading strategic planning across all paid media channels. I think she's really great, and she put her hand up to moderate this discussion. So I'm just going to throw it over to Michelle. Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm going to mute my voice and turn off my camera. And if anybody has any questions, we're going to take questions probably near the end of the panel, maybe 10 minutes left in the hour, and you can just type it directly into the chat here. So, Michelle, off to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Derek. So I thought I would start things off with a big statement. We have more data than ever, yet confidence in marketing ROI still remains very fragile. That's because most reporting is just decoration. It looks good, but it doesn't actually drive that next move. So today we're going to uncover how to communicate and build reports that actually survive the boardroom. We have a great panel, as Derek mentioned, Brian, the CEO of the Reporting Hub. He is that technical architect who ensures your data foundation is built for that executive scrutiny. Melissa, marketing director at Calgary Co-op, specializing in the high stakes translation of that marketing performance to business outcomes. And Jake, director of digital at Clear Motive, focused on bridging the gap between platform metrics and the strategic why behind every dollar spent. So you will notice that we don't actually have a CFO on the panel today, which I guess means we get to speak behind their backs for the next 50 minutes. So we thought the first place to start was really around questions about building that reporting foundation. So ensuring you have that right data integrated and have the why for what you're looking at reporting on. So Jake, I'm going to kick it off to you first. We know dashboards are only as good as the data that's in them. And you've mentioned to me before that about 90% of the setups that you review are either inaccurate or incomplete. What is that biggest, most common issue that you see that could be fixed immediately for reporting?
I've found it hard to pin it down to one, so I'm afraid I've got more than one. The first is not integrating everything and homogenizing everything. So if you're using Google Analytics, you're not pulling in revenue data, whether that's from Shopify or CRM, whatever it is. And also not connecting your ad platforms and tracking everything properly there. So that is critical, right? If we're talking about something that a CFO is going to trust, you might want to include how much money your marketing's making. And if you're using GA4 as your kind of base for marketing reporting, pull that data in. The other, I'll give a little anecdote. I audited an analytics setup for a business last year. They had over 50 conversion events. They were like everything was a conversion, which meant there was so much noise, you couldn't tell what was going on. And also, all of that was getting pushed into the algorithms for their paid media. So not only was it a complete mess of data that you couldn't really unpick very easily, but also it was just confusing all of the campaigns. So they were underperforming. The other one is just inaccurate source tracking. And this has been a bugbear of mine for years. Use your UTMs properly, use a template, make sure that they're tracking correctly. And nearly every single time I go in and there's just a mess of different UTMs. So I think, to recap that, make sure your platforms are integrated, make sure that your conversion events tie to revenue wherever possible. Don't call everything a conversion, just call the stuff that is likely to turn into money a conversion, and make sure that you're tagging and tracking everything properly. And those are the three biggest ones. I could go on about that for the whole webinar, and I won't.
Awesome. Thank you. I know taxonomy is so important in making sure that everything is actually flowing in properly and meaningful. Brian, can you talk to us about the executive dashboard versus the marketing dashboard? So how do we keep the CFO from getting lost in the tagging and tracking, as Jake mentioned, while still providing what needs to be done?
Yeah, good question. And I think, the answer I think is actually pretty basic if I could go there with it. And it really, for me, and I work with a lot of organizations over the years. I've been in data analytics and business intelligence for over 20 years. It comes down to communication ultimately is the person building the report, the person, finagling the data and, doing all the work in the background of, making sure the data is scrubbed and giving accurate results. And that person, whether they're building the dashboard for the marketer who needs the click-through rates and the click, the conversion events and all that, they need to make sure that data is going to the right person. But for the executive often isn't willing to get in the room and really just kind of do the dirty work of sitting down and like, what is it that I need? What is it that I care about? What are the metrics I'm tracking? And what are the metrics that I want to track mean? And I think that it's that communication that's often missing, and that's where that gap comes, where they're getting a report that says, "Hey, here's my KPI for whatever," and that KPI might not land with the executive. Well, that's fundamentally a communication problem of that not being communicated downstream to what are the points that they care about, how do they interpret that metric. The metric that I care about, how does that get translated into the data downstream so the person knows how to pull the data and correctly showcase the data. So it's not a technical answer. It's not a silver bullet. But for me, it boils down to communication.
And would you say it's really concise communication for that CFO? So really making sure that you have that executive overview that's top line and gives the what?
I think so. I think it has to start there. I think there has to be a high level of information of kind of what does that CFO care about? It's not going to be the click-through rate. It's going to be, some sort of return probably measure, are we getting the value from the spend we're doing? It's going to be a higher level metric. But to try to, leave it as a one metric per, I don't think it's a good idea either. You need to have a kind of a high level for the executives so they can look at it and know how are we doing at a glance? Are we stagnant? Are we growing? Are we going the wrong way? You need to be able to have that high level for sure in a report or a dashboard, but it also can't kind of start and stop there. That has to be the entry point, I think, not the overall solution of the dashboard. There has to be you have to be able to answer that question if there's a need for more questions because ultimately all dashboards and all KPIs do is drive more questions. So you kind of have to be able to think past the initial question when you're dealing with the CFO is, yes, I'm going to give them this metric, but what's inevitably going to be the follow-up question they're going to ask and then have that answered too.
Perfect. Makes sense. Melissa, we talked about that technical setup. How do you navigate the culture of reporting? So when you're presenting to leadership, how do you rebuild trust if that data doesn't seem to match the reality of that business bottom line?
No, I think that's a great question. I mean, if we're showing marketing data that isn't necessarily aligning to the sales or the lack of sales that we're seeing at that executive level, there absolutely is a disconnect. I think Brian touched on it quite a bit there in terms of the communication and identifying what is it that we all care about most, and if that is as simple as sales, starting at that point to make sure that the marketing story is telling the same story that the business is actually seeing, and then being able to show those data points for exactly that. So I think simplifying the conversation and then reconnecting the reporting there, I think it really does come down to speaking the same language about what we all want to see. I think in marketing, we have a lot of metrics that we measure, particularly on campaign specific KPIs that quite honestly, most people outside of marketing don't care about or don't understand enough to care about. So when we can get to the point where we are attributing that success to the growth of sales, margin, customer retention, we can get a little bit deeper afterwards into how we are achieving that. But first and foremost, the thing people care most about is going to be sales at the end of the day. So making sure that we can connect the dots in a meaningful way there. And then, like Brian said, for me, it's really all about the so what? Great. We have the report. What are we going to do with this? And what are the next steps so that we can keep moving forward?
Awesome. So talking more about communication, because that is kind of where we've shifted. So CFOs will often look at infrastructure such as a new warehouse as a multi-year asset, but marketing always is viewed as that current year expense. How do we shift that conversation so they see marketing as a long-term investment rather than just a cost to be cut? And I'll throw that again to you, Melissa.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, finance is right to challenge marketing if the only thing that we're coming to the table with is talking about campaigns. But when we can directly relate the campaign success to loyalty, to sales, then we have a much stronger leg to stand on. So that shift really does happen around when we can connect the dots to that long-term customer retention and growth. Again, I have the nice opportunity to work on both marketing and loyalty. So being able to see the long-term advantages of not only brand, but that retention strategy. So again, being able to show that success and that connection to that long-term growth is critical. Again, I go back to sales. So there's immediate sales, but there's also the promise of sales in the retention of a customer, and being able to speak to that and show what we are building on definitely is how we bring along the CFO and the rest of the executive team.
Awesome. Jake, do you have any thoughts on that from your perspective?
I think that in general, like the only professional group that I can think of who use more three-letter acronyms than us as marketers is financiers. And I think something that I'll often do in terms of reporting is you have the executive level on like maybe 2 or 3 slides and then a glossary, and then you show the working each time. It's like when you're solving a maths problem. I always used to get in trouble for this doing maths exam. I'd just write down the answer and I get them wrong sometimes. We all do. So you show you're working, right? And go a couple of layers deeper and then make sure that everybody is singing from the same hymn sheet. God, that's an awful cliche, but everybody is speaking the same language of like, hey, CTR means this, that means this, and in terms of the impact upon money, that is this. It's one of the core factors. So I think building that framework and that shared language is really, really important at the outset.
Makes sense. Brian, to speak CFO language, we have to move from efficiency to effectiveness, and lower cost per click. That doesn't always mean the business is growing. How do you build a report that clearly proves marketing is driving that incremental revenue?
Really good question, and I think it's a really tough question to answer, I think, in the world of marketing. And I think you first have to be willing to accept that you can't look at marketing on a short-term lens. If you look at marketing as a short-term lens, you're doing it wrong, I would say pretty clearly. And so there is a short-term component to it, sure. Clicks and this and that. But to really understand the value of marketing, it has to be viewed over time. It has to be viewed long term. And you have to be able to be willing to kind of go through the ebbs and flows and make your decisions based on, not just a data point, but a trending of data points over a significant period of time that you deem to be whatever your business or your industry is in as being kind of valid. So for me, that's what it comes down to. And my own company, when we look at marketing, we're very much not looking at it in isolation or the individual campaign or the individual event. We look at it marketing over, a rolling 6 months, a rolling 12 months, in terms of how we're actually getting returns and how we're actually doing on marketing and the successes we're having. Um, and we consciously kind of avoid doing the knee-jerk reactions of, oh, this happened, so we're going to change this, because I think it's to the detriment of the marketing organization to look at it that way.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know we're always trying to make sure that we're comparing numbers to something. So if it's year to date or month over month, just so we're not looking at something in silo and comparing it to industry average, but also looking at what our clients' history has been in order to see if, we are trending in the right direction or if we're not. But I mean, there's also environmental, political factors that play into it as well that you need to consider.
Yeah, and I think it's not putting too much stock into yes, you have KPIs, yes, you have measurements, yes, you're comparing to, different periods, period over period, or industry benchmarks or whatever. Yes to all those things, but it's not the be all and end all. You have to look at, marketing specifically with a little bit of flexibility in that. And it's never easy to say, well, I can't trust that number explicitly. Well, you can't. There's too many there's too many environmental factors, external factors. So you kind of have to you have to acknowledge that up front, I think. And I think the organizations that do that and the CFOs and the executives that understand that, I think are going to be more successful because you really do have to look at it for that lens. And yes, the metric might be telling you one number, but that number might have to be, analyzed against kind of like a rolling six versus just one period as an example. So
Mhm.
that's where it's not even just the number, it's how you look at that number and how you interpret that number. That really the organizations that understand it at that level, I think, are the ones who really operate at that next level.
Nice. Jake, as traditional data signals get quieter due to the privacy changes that are happening, attribution models are starting to look like guesswork to a CFO. So how are you maintaining that continuous story of marketing's value without relying on that perfect tracking that no longer exists?
Yeah, I love this question, and I think it's worth pointing out at the beginning that all the big tech companies are cosplaying as companies that care about privacy. And really, what they're doing is creating walled gardens, essentially. You know, we know this, right? Like, the Google antitrust trials very clearly showed they'll absolutely price fix and price manipulate. They just want to gather all of our data so they can sell stuff to us, right? But anyway, like I do think it's an important point to make and one to be aware of as you're thinking about your MarTech structure, who you're giving your data to, where it's being stored, and so on. I don't want to digress too far. So I come primarily from a digital background, and that's still trackable. Even if there are VPNs and people opting out, you can still go, I invested this much, I reached this many people, I had this many clicks, I had this many web visits, and look, I had some sales. But the perennial problem has been, what about those offline channels? What about, hey, we've done loads of podcast appearances, we've done loads of guest blogging, we've done a bunch of out of home or traditional channels. And, especially things like word of mouth and dark social, which do become more challenging. There are ways and means. And I think that has become bigger and bigger. And especially in terms of how search works with AI overviews, we've got more and more zero-click searches. People don't need to go to your website in order to find out the stuff they need to make a decision. So that is very interesting. There are tools out there that are starting to monitor that. But what most people are seeing is, hey, I'm getting less search traffic, which I've been a search wonk for years, so I'm like, oh great, this is really easy. Um, and what I would say on this is there are tools and there are ways that we can start to measure this, whether it's holdout testing, whether it's MMM, media mix modeling. Now, media mix modeling used to be very inaccessible unless you're spending probably over 1 million on media a month. And Michelle, I'm sure you know this, it's now because of AI and because of sort of the ability to tie together data sets, it's much more accessible. So maybe if you're a small business spending a couple of grand, it's not really worth doing. You're probably just looking at that digital, that typical digital funnel structure. But as you're doing more and spending more, thinking about brand salience and those long-term metrics, these kinds of things are more accessible, even if you can't afford that. As I say, it's much more accessible. Things like holdout testing. So, hey, what happens if we turn this off in this region? What's the long-term impact there? So, all of this means we should still be tracking digital and as well as possible. And let's get the basics right, because we're not, frankly, or certainly the businesses that I've been auditing a lot for the last few years. But we don't really have the excuse now to ignore everything else. Like there are ways that nearly any business can start to pull this in. Where I've ended up is often for, hey, should I switch this campaign from target ROAS to target CPA? Like that's where I'll use the platform and the immediate data. Where we're going to sort of for bigger clients and larger spends is looking at more of that cross channel, whether it's media mix modeling, whether it's holdout testing for those longer term budgetary decisions, right? Because that gives you the longer term impact. So that's kind of the direction that we're going. There's a huge amount of data out there, even if some of it is obfuscated by this cosplaying that the platforms do. And at the end of the day, a CFO doesn't care about cookies or pixels. They care about if are we creating a machine where I put in this amount of money and get this out, and what level of confidence can I do that with? So that will often come down to sort of scenario modeling, right? Like we can see that we have this trend line. If we increase conversion rate by X amount, we're going to get Y outcome. And isolating on the things, the levers that you know you can pull to give them more confidence.
Brian, do you have anything to jump in on that?
Yeah, I think specifically with attribution, it's getting harder and harder for sure. And we see it on our own business, the zero click. The world has changed a lot in the last year in terms of, all the things you thought you knew in terms of your metrics and your, what was to be an expected behavior has changed. And I think everybody's been trying to figure that out over the last kind of 6 to 8 months is what does this new world look like and how do we measure this new world? And attribution is a really, big challenge. But I'm going to agree with Jake and say our head of marketing has done a phenomenal job in going out and finding new tools to fill the holes and fill the gaps. And there's so many new tools and there's so many new things available and it's changing rapidly. Every week there's something new coming out in terms of how you can analyze and measure this stuff and how you can, understand how your brand's, being picked up in the LLMs. And I think you need to be willing to adopt these things and you need to be willing to look at these new tools and figure out how they can fill the holes of attribution and be okay with, potentially having to, if I can only, get 70% attribution, that might be the best you're ever going to do. But that's still really good to be able to make a decision on. And striving to 100% attribution is just not realistic either. So yeah, I think I agree very much with Jake, and I think there are a lot of things happening that are making marketers' lives easier in today's time. But you need to be willing to adapt, change, try out these tools, try out how these things work, and you definitely kind of have to forget some of the things you thought you knew.
I do
I
feel
like,
like, oh,
go
sorry,
ahead.
Go ahead, Melissa.
No, I was going to say, I think this exact conversation lends itself very well to why it can be very difficult to relay the ultimate information to CFOs and the executive team because we're saying it ourselves is that the attribution is challenging. What we're trying to look at has changed significantly. I mean, I feel like I've been in a place where I sell everyone on, hey, we're going for this many clicks. And then the next year is like, oh, we actually don't care about those clicks anymore. And trying to bring people along for that journey is a little bit challenging when you're trying to change your KPIs and what the story is. And so I think it goes back ultimately to what we kind of said at the beginning here is what is that story and how do we say it in a way that makes sense for that executive level because all the pieces that put that story together are constantly changing and it is challenging to navigate and it is very convoluted. So sorry, Michelle, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna jump on the MMM conversation that Jake started. So I do feel like it is a bit of a buzzword now. It seems like everyone's talking about MMM models. And they used to be very expensive, and there are now companies that have come to the table with something that's quite accessible. But I will say what I've seen is you really need to ask questions about what is the data within that MMM model and what's been ingested and how they're using it, because there's so many factors that can affect the outcome. So just really making sure you're curious and challenging what is in that versus just saying yes and giving them your data, because that will really affect the results of that.
Especially if you're making big budget decisions off that, like how, what's the weighting of the, how is that metric versus that metric being determined? I agree.
Yeah, and even just like what's happening from a competitive landscape at that same time. Again, I've talked about environmental, political factors. Those should all be included within an MMM study because that can affect consumer decision making. So Brian, we often deliver reports on a marketing schedule, whether monthly, quarterly, but CFOs typically operate on that capital allocation schedule. So are you seeing a shift in how and when data needs to be presented so that it actually aligns with that CFO's budgeting windows rather than just those campaign cycles as we're traditionally used to?
Yes and no. I think the modern world of data has really shifted in the last kind of couple of years to, if you're operating, a month in, the past, that's you're doing it wrong. So going back to that point is the expectation today is that data is ready whenever you need it. And if you don't have a data, backend that supports data being accessible, pretty much in near real time, and it doesn't have to be real time, but certainly near real time, then that question needs to be addressed first, I would say, because that's the expectation now. And I would say certainly executives and CFOs, the expectation isn't that you're waiting to the end of the month or you're waiting to the end of the quarter. That you should be able to analyze things kind of as they're happening um, and that's just the expectation now. So, and if you're an organization that's kind of not operating at that level, then you're definitely kind of operating in a yesteryear time period.
Melissa, would you say that's similar for you in terms of how you're functioning with the reporting level?
Absolutely. I feel like there is that expectation of that always on data, which actually I think does cause a bit of a problem because there's, I would almost say, too frequent of check ins.
Mhm.
We're not giving things enough time to actually build to have that forward momentum. For example, there was a point where we were reporting on membership growth weekly. Okay, the numbers aren't significant enough to continue to report on this weekly. There isn't enough of a story to tell. And I think people get really caught up in those numbers when there is a much bigger story that we need to be focusing on. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think being able to kind of condense the periods in which we're providing certain metrics, I'm not saying there's not a time and a place for that always on, but I do think people can get a little over consumed in the fact that data is at our fingertips and asking for data that no one's actually making a decision with. So, yeah, I feel like it's a bit of a catch 22 sometimes.
Yeah, I want to elaborate
Jake,
just a bit on my earlier comment to that point because it's a great point. It's like the expectation of data is near real time, but which is why it's so important to agree on what your metrics mean and measure because just because you have data available right now doesn't mean that you should be looking at it right now if that measurement needs a 6 month time period to and I think that's why that becomes so important is because you have to have that level of expectation, that baseline of what means what in your organization. Just because data exists in near real time doesn't necessarily mean you're making a decision off of that.
Mm.
Jake, how do you navigate that at the agency level?
I think it's setting expectations early on and explaining that, I mentioned it before, but that shared language that we're going to use for, hey, we predict this. And something I do, especially for bigger projects or bigger campaigns, is try and build out somewhat of the forecast. Like, go beyond just going, hey, we should spend this amount of money on this stuff and hope for the best. But like, based on the analytics that we've got, getting a few scenario models in place. So, like, hey, if this is true and this is true, then with this, if we tweak this metric, this is what we should expect. We tweak this. And I think CFOs, I mean, they're walking spreadsheets, right? You don't get many of them that aren't empirical, numbers driven people. And so be empirical about how you approach it, right? At the end of the day, yes, there is wizardry and complex mathematics between attribution modeling, but marketing is the same. You've got people who have never heard of you, and you've got people who love buying your stuff, and there is a journey in between. And there are stages for those that you can roughly model. And at each stage of that journey, you can figure out, hey, if we double that bit, here's what happens. If we half that bit, here's what happens. And so bringing it down to that and then figuring out and explaining in clear logical terms, if we do this, this ought to do this. And I think something that we get stuck on in marketing a lot, going back to the TLAs or three-letter acronyms, is pretending that we're cleverer than we are and that we are doing rocket science. Really, we I know our jobs are busy and complex, but a lot of the time we should be able to explain, hey, if we make the CTA on this page a little bit more prominent, more people will click on it and more people will buy our stuff. Like things like that, being able to explain it in a way that is logical and clear, I think is very, very important indeed. And as I say, presenting that scenario modeling of here's what I'm proposing you should invest, here's why I think so, and if this number does better, this is what happens. If this number does worse, this is what happens. And then also making sure you have scale and kill switches, right? So we're doing this. This is the point at which we decide it's failing. Stop spending that money. This is the point at which we should say, hey, can you give us some more money because we should do more of this? And defining that from the outset, like a lot of my role is setting those expectations at the beginning. And a lot of the time I'm dealing with the marketing people who need to deal with the CFOs, trying to make their life easier.
Nice. I think this is a good segue. So this one's for you again, Jake. Some CFOs are definitely very marketing first, and others are very cost cutting. So
Mhm.
some believe in it, some don't. In your experience, how do you adjust your data storytelling when you're dealing with a skeptic who views marketing as an optional expense versus a partner who sees it as a growth lever?
So either way, I'm going to bring them the data that I see first. And sometimes that data is messy or unavailable or whatever it is, but I will pull together and explain to them how I've done that. Like, hey, here is what we're seeing now. These people didn't become your customers by magic. Here is how they became your customers. And even when people are highly skeptical, and there are cases like this, there are times where I'll literally say, hey, rather than spending all this money on ads, you should hire a new salesperson. It's very easy for the agency person to believe that they're a hammer and therefore every single thing is a nail. It's simply not the case, right? But once again, I'll go back to being empirical and as evidence-based as possible with either type of stakeholder to formulate here is where we are. And then depending on how risk averse they are, really presenting that scenario modeling and that forecasting that I talked about earlier of like, if this, then that. And really it's about how much persuasion needs to happen. If they're already bought in, then probably there are less spreadsheets for me to make. If then, and I like doing it either way because then it makes my life easier down the road and it makes everybody's life easier down the road, whether it's the marketing team internally, my team, whoever. Um, and I think though the metrics that I talk about are different. If I'm talking to somebody who's deeply skeptical, I'll do things like look at share of search. I'll look at things like, hey, we need to defend market share. Look how many people are running ads against us. Look at all this SEO work where they're saying how much better their feature set is than ours. I'll think about incrementality and marginal gains more. Whereas, if it's somebody who is just a pure play partner, I'll talk about as we scale diminishing marginal returns and when to sort of think about switching up or introducing new channels. So it does depend a bit, but in general, starting from that same empirical base, creating some models, and then talking about different kind of metrics. And the other point I'll make here is that sometimes you'll have a sort of a C-suite or a senior exec, whether it's CFO or not, who are quite they do believe in marketing. But Michelle, to your point, there's nothing going on in the world outside at the moment that could possibly cause any market disruption whatsoever, is there? But even if they're bought into what you're planning and what you're saying, taking into account those external factors and what might happen and putting those into your models as well. Sometimes it's hard to do that agency side because you don't want to just blame something going wrong. You want to take accountability as well as paint an accurate picture and an objective picture. But I think taking all of those facts into account in terms of how you communicate, but in general, mostly the same, but potentially some more defensive metrics of like market share. How do we defend that? How do we defend our feature set? Versus here's what it looks like when we scale. Here's what diminishing marginal or incrementality looks like as we go up.
Makes sense. Thanks. So yeah, really about bringing all that data to the table, and it's just how much further the storytelling has to go in order to convince them based
Yeah.
off of if they believe or not.
If they really like spreadsheets, I'll show them a lot of spreadsheets.
Melissa, there's often a wall between marketing and finance until the budget meeting. Should the CFO be brought into the kitchen while you're cooking that measurement strategy, or should you only show them the finished meal? How would you build that partnership before the high stakes presentation?
So for me, this is a critical partnership and a practice that we do, I would say, quite well at Calgary Co-op, is bringing everyone along for the journey. And I know that that has always been part of my relationship building and getting that credibility for marketing and loyalty. Bringing everyone along to understand the strategy, the shifts, the assumptions behind the numbers, both from their side, from my side. Because at the end of the day, what I really want is everyone across this business being able to show up and speak the same language about marketing. So having those marketing brand ambassadors across the entire business. We have 6 lines of business, so making sure that we are able to connect the dots for everyone can be a little bit challenging. But when we meet them on their individual levels, it does become a lot easier to connect that story, and then ultimately, we're all saying the same thing to the CFO in terms of where we're going and how we're getting there. Ultimately, marketing is a support system for the business. We're still thought leaders. That doesn't mean we're just doing what we're told. We're the thought leaders of the business in service of the business. And so being able to make sure that everyone understands exactly that support that they're getting. And that does come down to the CFO as well, making sure that they understand exactly the money that we're putting behind different measures, what that looks like, and also the risk if we don't do it. So that's been a big part of, I would say, the last couple of years, is just as budgets become tighter. I'm sure we're all feeling it. What does that look like if we don't get this money? And that's not a threat. It is a true statement of, if we are not investing in these opportunities, there are things that are going to ultimately happen, and we need to have that conversation with our business leaders as well. So yes, I think everyone should be brought to the table, not just the CFO, and really truly understanding the impacts of marketing. And I think, again, when people understand the logic behind the decisions that we're making, they're also more keen to back us, support us, and push forward with the agenda we have. That sounds really negative, very manipulative, but ultimately it is the agenda that we're moving forward with for marketing.
And Brian, what does that look like from your perspective in terms of collaboration of building out a dashboard and that measurement framework?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the kind of what I said in the first question, is back to that communication, and ultimately it's buy-in, and buy-in on what does success look like. And I think when you have buy-in of what does success look like, then you can have accountability, and then everybody agrees going into it. It's, hey, we all agree this is what success looks like. It's this metric analyzed this way, and this was the expectation. And when we do, if we hit it, great. If we don't hit it, great. Well, we all still agree that this was the. And I think that it's that fundamental element of having that buy-in, having that agreement through communication of what success looks like, when we're talking about metrics and data, with respect to growth and returns. If we do those things, I think, we're going to have success. And I'm a fundamental believer that every business problem can be solved with communication, and this is no different. And which is why that buy-in, if the CFO is waiting to see the finished presentation, then I don't think that's going to be for the best of the organization. I do agree that person should be involved throughout. They don't need to be in the weeds on every single meeting, but certainly involved at a level of understanding why the metrics are decided upon, understanding how those metrics are calculated, and how they're analyzed, and agreeing on what are the ones that we care about and what are the ones we don't care about. The CFO and the executive team does need to be involved, I believe, in those stages of the process.
Yeah, I think it helps keep everything cleaner moving down the line when you're reporting, because everyone's accountable to those metrics if you've agreed on them. And that's what you focus on reporting on and holding your optimizations to. So
yeah, and I think that, just to add to it, I think the danger sometimes with marketing is taking the approach of, well, marketing is inherently difficult to measure. I can't really measure it because of the external. So, and kind of falling back to that mindset. And I think that that's the danger is you can't do that. So it's we still have to be accountable to something, and we still have to be accountable to and be able to deliver on something. But we all need to go into it agreeing what that is. And we all need to go into it agreeing that yes, there's some ambiguity in things, but that's okay. We all agree on it going in, um, and as long as marketers do that, I think then you're good. I think the problems are when it goes the other way, where it's like, hey, I can't measure this.
All right, I have a question that I'll get each of you guys to answer. So, if the CFO had the final say in the reporting structure, what would the first thing be that they would delete from it? What don't they want to see on that report? Who
I'll
wants?
take a stab at that. I think they would say 95% of what's on the dashboard. Um, but I would also say they are saying that because they don't understand 95% of it. Or they don't understand 70% of it. And I think again, that's a big part of the problem is often it's this isn't giving me what I need. It's not answering my questions. There's too much information, or I don't care about this metric, I care about that metric. It's ultimately it just comes down to being like there's a gap of what they want and what they're being given in terms of reporting and what a dashboard is. Um, and so it will show up as they just don't look at that dashboard. And everybody who builds dashboards and reports, obviously there's better analytics than there ever has been in terms of usage analytics of your dashboards. So you certainly need to look at those usage analytics of, is this being looked at? How long was the CFO looking at that report? These are all metrics you can do very easily today. And you need to be able to pay attention to these. You can go right down to the individual visual level, depending on what tools you're using, of who the CFO looked at this report for, 15 seconds. They only looked at the first page. They didn't go to page three. And, it's understanding that. And that's going to tell you a lot in terms of what they care about and what they don't care about without having to even have a conversation with them. But I think ultimately, if you can have that conversation, figure out what they care about, have those analytics to understand what are they looking at, what are they not, you'll end up in a much better position.
Maybe we need to put heat mapping software on our dashboards.
I mean, th those things exist. There are heat
Yeah,
mapping. Like this is what I mean. Like there's incredible analytics tools for these things now where you can have heat mapping, you can have, like Google Analytics style analytics, but for the actual reports themselves.
Mhm.
And that becomes a critical piece of information too.
No, I agree with you, Brian. I think 95% of what we're seeing definitely could be cut. And I don't know about everyone else, but we have a variety of sources that are providing different dashboards. And so I think being able to consolidate that into one piece of truth with the outcomes of so what next? Because ultimately that is what the CFO is asking. So what are we doing with this information? Because if we're just looking at the data as a nice to have, as a report that we're filing away, who cares? So I do think it comes down to those couple of key metrics, and then also the story of how we're moving forward. So a bit about the data, but more about what we're doing with it is what I would say.
Yeah.
That's smart to use the analytics from the dashboard to get your answer for what the CFO actually wants to look at and what they don't and how they're engaged with it. They're the customer of that dashboard.
Absolutely.
Um, Okay, one more question for me, and then we'll pass it over to the audience. So I think this is quite timely right now, and we were talking about this before the webinar started, but a lot of people are looking to AI to solve their data analytics. What is the biggest risk of handling your marketing data over to AI for a boardroom report? And Jake, I'll throw it to you first.
So my natural position, as you might have gathered, is to be pretty skeptical about big tech, even though like a lot of my job is persuading clients to spend on big tech. And it's kind of a weird position to be in, but I love using it and it's enabling me to do stuff that I couldn't before in terms of sort of like roughing out incrementality testing for harder to track audiences or harder to track channels and so on. So I love it. Please, so I want to frame this, but it still gets stuff wrong. Like I was building out a kind of complex Google Analytics report last week, and I asked Gemini for some help, and it was telling me to do stuff that was from Universal Analytics, and those dimensions don't even exist. So it still gets stuff wrong. And even when it's not, and you've trained it and you've guided it and you've got your own custom GPT or your custom gem or whatever it is, it still lacks context. So, yeah, I have a client I've worked on here for 8 years, and we've been testing out how to leverage. Part of it is the data management, which we've got pretty nailed down, but part of it is also, okay, what can it pull any insights that we didn't think of? And the interesting thing there is it does pull some, but about 1 in 3 are worth using, like actually because of the context. And that's hard as well, because on the agency side, I'm the only actual single common denominator there. Maybe a couple of client side people on the agency team, they'll pull this report and it'll go, oh yeah, look, we should be doing this. I didn't think of that. And I'm like, yeah, we tried it 4 years ago and it didn't work because of this, and still won't work now because of this. Sometimes I'll be like, oh, maybe we can test it again. So the fact that it doesn't always have all of that context, even when you've managed it super, super well, tread carefully, right? I ultimately, where I get to with AI is I don't want it to think for me. I want it to augment me, and I want it to do the plumbing for me. So where I found it really useful is, for example, trying to set up something fiddly on Tag Manager or something fiddly in terms of connecting platforms. Really, really good at going, oh, you missed this setting. Like if it, building together the infrastructure or building out a better data warehouse or giving me a better SQL query to pull out. That's what I'm loving using it for, rather than actually the thinking, because a lot of the time it just doesn't have the universal data. Always, anything AI, human in the like my view is start with a human, end with a human, and then some human probably in the middle to kind of course correct it. But it does amazing stuff, and it's definitely cleverer when guided properly than most of us are. But make sure that you are quality controlling. I haven't even got into compliance and where you should be sharing data and any of that, and I'll let somebody else have a chat about that.
Brian, do you want to jump in on that?
Sure. Yeah, this is I live very, very deeply in this world every day. And definitely it's a hot topic these days and will continue to be. Um, it's not going away. It's not going anywhere. So, I'm going to agree with Jake on the, cautious approach, but I do think there's a real danger in what I'm seeing with a lot of organizations right now and the way they're letting being cautious, uh, um, drive really, I think, bad decisions long term for the organization. Yes, you have to be cautious in your adoption of AI, and yes, you have to have governance in place to not let data just go into the ether. And you do need to have policies and guidelines and guardrails, all of that stuff. Um, to do that, though, you do need to really invest in the proper tools, the proper technology, the proper backends, the proper data structure, the way in which you surface the AI insights. These are very, very meaningful, deliberate questions organizations need to tackle head on and not just think like Microsoft Copilot or Claude or whatever is the solution, because it's part of the solution, but it's not the solution. And I think what I'm seeing happening is a lot of organizations they're seeing this as a nightmare of governance and a nightmare of, oh, I'm going to give the wrong answer 30% of the time. And their reaction is to just go the complete opposite way, which is like, we're not going to do that. And I think that's a really, really dangerous approach today to not be on the forefront of this technology. I think every organization needs to be, my take on it is every organization needs to be at the forefront of the technology, but use it very cautiously and use the tools that are available to ensure that an enterprise organization can deliver these things safely and securely and with guardrails. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's just, Gemini or a custom GPT. It's actually investing in the proper infrastructure required to do these things. So I'm a big proponent of AI. It's not going anywhere, but it's the organizations that tackle these things head on today are the ones who are going to be successful tomorrow. Because although they're only, let's say, 70% accurate today, it's not going to be that way forever. So the organizations that accept the kind of challenges of AI today, but build processes around it, are going to be the organizations that are ready to deploy, with hit the ground running when these things get better and better over time. So I think you need to stay at the forefront, but you need to, do it in a way that's cautious.
Melissa, do you have anything to add to that from your perspective and the challenges you guys are facing?
Honestly, I think Jake and Brian nailed it. So I'm gonna, unless you have anything to add, I think we can go to some of the questions from the audience.
Perfect. Yeah, Derek, do you want to jump in with some of those questions?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. This has been great because as you were all speaking, I was like, oh, this is like quite a diverse cast of characters here. We've got two agency folks. We've got somebody, I guess, who's on the, I guess, business to customer slash customer to customer side of things, adjacent, I guess, with Melissa at Calgary Co-op, and then, we've got B2B SaaS with Brian. We had one question here. And Brian, you might actually be a little biased towards this question because you have a tool. But Sheena is asking, going back to tools, which are you and your team enjoying the most right now, and what makes them so useful to you?
Yeah, I mean, if I could ask for to clarify what tools, because I mean the term tool is like wow, there's a tool for everything nowadays. So like,
Yeah.
maybe a little bit more idea of what tool, like specific, like is it reporting tools? Is it dashboarding tools? Is it kind of like very specific? But we're I think from a reporting standpoint, we're very much kind of proponents of Power BI and Microsoft and the data analytics suite and the back end data components in that world. There's really there's no excuse not to have good data anymore. There's not. So whether it's Microsoft or any one of the big providers of data platforms and data analytics tools, they're all really great. But ultimately you need to find a tool that is the right choice for your organization from a costing perspective and that. But we are live in the Power BI and Microsoft world in terms of our back end, in terms of business intelligence data analytics. In terms of marketing tools, I'll let the kind of core marketers answer those, but we use a lot of marketing tools and I'll jump in on those, but I'll let the marketers maybe tackle that one.
And we use Looker for our dashboarding. Like I love Power BI, like we're a Google shop and like have, our whole workspace is Google, and Looker integrates so beautifully with a lot of the tools that I use. Um, there are loads of little tools, right, that we've been trying out across different areas. One, I'd say though, in terms of techniques, and this goes back to a lot of what we've been saying in terms of clean data infrastructure, getting the data to be accurate. So we're doing a lot more work around that in terms of implementing data warehouses and specifically, and I know this is very nerdy, but implementing server-side tagging. Like for me, I'm kind of tool agnostic, right? I don't sure if this is shiny and fun, but there's a gazillion shiny and fun things to play with. For me, it's sort of what are the things that need to be done in order to get the data and to get the outcome I want to make my life easier and less stressful. And a lot of the time, it is those pulling those data pieces together, which can be done a lot more easily than they used to be. So I'd say those, if you are looking for a server-side tagging, Stape is a great tool for implementing it, or you can get a clever human to do it.
We
For
just implemented Stape too.
Yeah, it's good. It's
Yeah.
pretty solid, and especially if you're in a regulated industry like healthcare, for example, we do a bit of work there where HIPAA compliance. If you're BetterHelp, sure, you can just eat a $5 million fine for sharing PHI. Most healthcare companies cannot do that, so it really enables not just the accuracy, but also you to control where your data is going. And so, I know that's not answering specific tool stuff. I mean, state PS, but I'll go back to making sure, the data management, and it depends what your data is and where it is and what you're using to funnel it and so on and so forth. Um, Plus, Claude Code is pretty cool, I will say, in
Yeah,
terms
if
of
you're not using Claude Cowork, I would
yeah,
challenge everybody to at
yeah,
least
go and
learn
have a
about
play around.
it because yeah, it's pretty game changing. And one of the other tools that I really like that we're using just to throw it out there is I'm not sure if it's peak.ai or
Yeah, I
peak.io. I'm not sure which one it is, but
think it's .ai
is it
for
AI? Yeah, it gives you visibility into how the like the LLM search is picking up your brand and your messaging, which has been really helpful for us.
yeah, it's the best one in
Yeah,
terms of LLM visibility because
yeah.
they don't focus on they're looking at semantic clusters and LLMs do not work. Like what any of us might type in to ask a question is vastly different than who's the best supermarket in Calgary, right? Yeah, it's just a different kettle of fish.
Yeah, that's great. I know Mark is hiding here. If he has any questions, I'd love for him to turn his mic on. But one question that I had, I'm not sure if we really touched on it, is the kind of, I guess, the tension between, there's brand investment and then there's actual performance marketing. So how do you kind of evaluate, I guess, spending to a CFO on something that you can't really I guess, quantify as much, like brand investment?
I mean, I can take that one.
Sure.
Again, it does come down to reporting and data. It's just longer term reporting and longer term data. So that annual brand monitor that we do once a year feels like it takes a really long time to get there to kind of justify some of those brand decisions that we've been making with some pulse checks along the way. But again, it goes into those consumer insights, which is just not directly related to sales, but sentiment and likelihood to recommend, things like that, which are also very critical, but tend to be, in my case, the much harder pieces to sell the budget on because we do have to wait a much longer period of time for us to be able to see that return on investment. So, still very critical. And when I am building that budget, as we talked about earlier, where I'm selling the CFO and the executive team on that, actually separating those pieces out in terms of these are the longer term investments that we're going to make. These are the ones that you're going to see immediately, and just being very open around how we're going to measure those.
Yeah, great answer. Thank you, Melissa. Yeah. Mark, did you have anything?
Oh, there's so many things. You guys are all awesome at this. I love the conversation. One thing on the tools front, I recently talked to a few people from Tracksuit from a brand measurement perspective, which is an insanely affordable, kind of what you were saying before, Jake. It's not MMM, but it's brand tracking software, which is becoming more and more affordable because it used to be insanely expensive and now it's more and more affordable. So I'd say that's an interesting one. But overall, I mean, I just love the conversation, like the skepticism maybe in the dashboards, the like, do we understand what we're even measuring part, I think is really important. The communication, I think, is really important. Actually, so Michelle, maybe let me ask you a question then. When it comes to we talked about the dashboards having like 95% of things there that don't actually mean much to many people. How do you establish like what are the metrics on your end or in general, like what that we should be tracking?
Yeah, when we're building out our media strategy, we'll make sure there's a measurement framework in there right from the start. So even before we'll go into like detailed planning, and align on that. So it's back to what Melissa was saying is what's short term, what's long term, what's more brand side, what's more performance side, and how, and the hardest thing is measuring that brand performance because a lot of clients won't set that budget aside for proper measurement framework tracking. So doing those brand or campaign studies. But it really comes down to kind of siloing each of the channels and the tactics within those channels to figure out what we want to like measure on at the end of the day. So some of those more traditional channels, it is more about that reach frequency. And then if there's brand tracking in place, ensuring that we're hitting those goals that we're setting out in terms of percentage change. And then from that lower funnel, it's just about looking at if we can cost per acquisition, ROAS, those kind of bottom funnel. I think the hardest part right now is people are still talking about impressions. People are still talking about clicks, and it's the impression ones is the hardest because every impression is different. An impression on TV is very different than an impression from a digital banner. And so it's just making sure that we're holding each of our measurement results to what that channel can truly offer and ensuring that it's framed properly.
Yeah, thanks. I could talk to you guys forever about this, but I think we're getting close to the end. Derek, do you have a couple of things to follow up on, or is there any other questions from the guests?
Yeah, it doesn't look like we have any other questions from the audience here, but thank you to the four of you so much. Michelle, thanks for, well, I think I voluntold you to moderate. You did a really great job, and thank you so much to the rest of the panel as well, Jake, Brian, Melissa. This is a fantastic conversation. Folks, we'll have the recording delivered to your email. I think tomorrow morning. I think I have it set up for. And I apologize. I think some folks had some issues with the view of the webinar and not being able to see each speaker as they spoke, I guess it would be. But we'll get that solved moving forward here. But yeah, thank you so much to the four of you for joining us. Thank you so much to Learngistics for helping us out here. And we're back tomorrow with another webinar. So hope to see everyone in the attendee list here tomorrow as well. And yeah, thanks again.
Thanks,
Thanks.
everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
All right, take care, folks.